They said a dog never guards what doesn't matter. But at 11:43 p.m. inside the quiet perimeter of Raven Rock Military Depot, no one could explain why a German Shepherd had turned a simple locked suitcase into something worth standing in the cold for without moving an inch. Officer Daniel Carter stepped out of the transport vehicle with the kind of slow certainty a man carries when he has been called back to a place he once tried to forget. The air was sharp at around 42 degrees Fahrenheit, dry. Enough that every breath felt like it had edges. Overhead, the floodlights buzzed faintly against the dark sky, casting pale circles across the asphalt where everything looked still except for one shape. Rex, a sable-coated German Shepherd with steady amber eyes, standing perfectly aligned with a metal suitcase that sat directly in front of him like it belonged there. Daniel paused before he even spoke because something about the scene didn't match protocol, didn't match logic, and didn't match anything he remembered from his years of service. The suitcase was standard-issue military-grade aluminum, reinforced corners, dual-lock system, no external markings except a faded transport tag that had been partially scraped clean. But what made it unsettling wasn't the object itself, it was the way Rex was guarding it, not aggressively, not wildly, but with a controlled stillness that felt intentional, as if every muscle in his body had agreed on one mission and refused to negotiate. Otherwise, Daniel stepped closer and stopped 3 feet away. Rex didn't growl, didn't retreat, he simply shifted his stance slightly, placing himself between Daniel and the suitcase with quiet certainty, like a decision already made long before anyone arrived. A nearby security light flickered once, then stabilized, and in that brief interruption of brightness Daniel noticed something else, faint scratch marks on the suitcase handle, fresh enough to suggest recent handling. He lowered his voice instinctively as if the night itself demanded respect. "Easy, Rex, it's me." But the dog didn't respond the way he expected. Instead, Rex tilted his head just slightly, recognition flickering in his eyes for a fraction of a second before settling back into vigilance. Daniel felt a tight pull in his chest, because that look wasn't unfamiliar. Rex had once belonged to his unit, back during deployment rotations in Nevada when desert winds carried dust like memory, and every mission ended with silence that lasted too long. They had been partners then, not just handler and K9, but something closer to trust built under pressure most people never see. Yet here Rex was now, standing guard over something Daniel had not been briefed about, something that wasn't listed in any active record he had access to. A second vehicle rolled in behind him, brakes whispering against gravel, and 2 military police officers stepped out, their posture alert but uncertain. One of them gestured toward the suitcase. "Sir, we've been instructed to secure that immediately," he said. But before anyone could move forward, Rex shifted again, this time lowering his head slightly and planting his paws more firmly against the ground, not threatening, just absolute, as if the concept of giving space to the suitcase was no longer an option. Daniel raised a hand subtly to pause them, because something about Rex's behavior wasn't resistance, it was protection, and protection always meant context, always meant history, always meant something had already happened before anyone arrived. Daniel crouched slowly to Rex's level, maintaining eye contact the way he had been trained to do in situations where animals carried stress they couldn't verbalize. "What are you holding on to?" he asked softly, though not expecting an answer. Rex didn't break eye contact, but his ears shifted slightly toward the suitcase, and that small movement changed everything about the moment, because it wasn't random, it was direction, communication without words, and suddenly Daniel noticed the faint vibration beneath the suitcase. So subtle it could have been mistaken for engine hum from the distant generators, but it was consistent, rhythmic, controlled, like something within had a pulse of its own. The air felt tighter now, not dangerous, but heavy with unknown purpose. One of the officers stepped forward again, impatience breaking. "Through procedure, sir, we need to open it." But Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied Rex, the way his posture never wavered, the way his loyalty wasn't directed at authority, but at something inside that metal shell. And for the first time since arriving, Daniel realized this wasn't a containment situation, it was a decision point, because whatever Rex was guarding wasn't just an object. It was connected to memory, to trust, and possibly to something that had never been fully reported. After their last assignment together, Daniel exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of unanswered questions settle in. And as he reached for the handle, Rex didn't stop him. But he didn't move either, as if he understood that whatever happened next was not about obedience or protocol, but about truth waiting quietly inside a locked suitcase at midnight. Daniel did not move for several seconds. Not because he was unsure of what he saw, but because he was trying to understand why something so simple as a locked suitcase could feel heavier than any briefing he had ever received. The night air around Raven Rock Military Depot remained still, but now it felt different, like it had shifted its attention toward the center of the scene, toward Rex and the silent object he refused to leave. Officer Daniel Carter finally lowered himself fully into a crouch, placing his boots flat on the cold concrete, his breath visible in short, controlled intervals. He studied the suitcase first, then Rex, then the space between them, as if the answer was written somewhere in that invisible line of loyalty. One of the military police officers adjusted his stance behind him, shifting his weight with a subtle impatience that tried to stay respectful. But Daniel raised a hand again without looking back, signaling silence, because whatever was happening here was not procedural anymore. It was personal in a way that did not yet have a name. Rex's ears flicked once toward the sound of distant machinery, then returned to Daniel, never leaving him fully. As if confirming recognition while still refusing permission, Daniel spoke again, softer this time, almost as if speaking to memory instead of the present. "You remember me," he said, not as a question, but as a fact he needed to say out loud to anchor himself. And for a brief moment Rex's posture changed in a way only someone who had worked with dogs for years would notice. The tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction, not enough to step aside, but enough to acknowledge the connection. Daniel's eyes moved back to the suitcase, its metallic surface reflecting a distorted version of the floodlight above, and in that reflection he noticed something he had missed earlier, a small identifier etched into the corner, partially scratched but still readable enough to trigger recognition, a classification code tied to a unit he had served under years ago, a unit that had been officially disbanded after an operation that never appeared in public records. His jaw tightened slightly as he processed that detail, because that meant this suitcase was not random, not misplaced, and certainly not forgotten. It had been carried here, intentionally or retrieved from a place that was never meant to be revisited. Behind him, one of the officers finally spoke again, more cautiously this time. "Sir, we are showing no active clearance for that item." Daniel nodded slowly without turning around, absorbing the weight of that confirmation. Because no clearance meant no oversight, and no oversight meant someone had bypassed every chain that was supposed to prevent exactly this kind of situation. Rex shifted again, this time stepping a few inches closer to the suitcase, not to attack, not to guard aggressively, but to reinforce his position as if the object itself required witness. Daniel noticed that Rex was not watching the officers. He was watching the suitcase, and that distinction mattered more than anything else in the moment. Daniel reached slowly toward the ground beside him and picked up a small handheld scanner that had been left by the arriving unit. He activated it, and the device emitted a soft, continuous tone as it passed near the suitcase. The screen displayed inconsistent signals, nothing stable enough to classify, just fragments of encrypted data that seemed to appear and disappear as if resisting interpretation. Daniel exhaled through his nose, steadying himself, because uncertainty in equipment usually meant interference, but interference at this level meant intention. He looked back at Rex again, and this time he noticed something new in the dog's eyes, not just recognition, but restraint, as if Rex was holding himself in place not because he was ordered to, but because leaving would mean breaking something unspoken. Daniel lowered his voice even further, almost a whisper now meant only for the space between them. "What happened here before I arrived?" he asked, and for the first time Rex broke his stillness slightly, shifting his head toward the left side of the depot, where the loading bays stood quiet under dim security lighting. Daniel followed the direction of that glance and saw nothing unusual, just sealed doors and empty space. But the implication was enough to tighten the atmosphere further, because now the suitcase was no longer the only question. It was part of a sequence, part of something that had already unfolded before anyone called him to the scene. The officers behind him exchanged a look, but remained still, waiting for command. But Daniel was no longer thinking in commands. He was thinking in fragments, in missing context, In the kind of silence that only appears after something important has already passed, he slowly extended his hand again toward the suitcase, stopping just short of contact. And in that moment, Rex did not growl, did not step forward, but his eyes sharpened with a quiet intensity that told Daniel everything he needed to know without words. Whatever was inside that metal shell was not just an object of interest. It was a continuation of something unfinished, and whatever decision Daniel made next would not simply open a suitcase. It would complete a story that had already begun long before midnight. The silence inside Raven Rock Military Depot had begun to feel less like an absence of sound and more like a held breath, as if the entire facility was waiting for Daniel Carter to make a decision it refused to make for him. He kept his hand suspended just inches from the metal surface of the suitcase, feeling an invisible pressure that had nothing to do with protocol and everything to do with instinct. Rex remained motionless beside it, his body angled in a way that made it clear he was not blocking access out of aggression but out of duty, the kind of duty that does not require orders to exist. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly as he studied the faint seam of the suitcase, noticing now that the locking mechanism was not standard military design. It was older, modified, as if it had been rebuilt to resist simple access rather than formal clearance. Behind him, one of the military police officers shifted again but remained silent, sensing that whatever line they were approaching had already been crossed long before they arrived. Daniel exhaled slowly and withdrew his hand, not in retreat, but in recalibration, because experience had taught him that forcing answers without understanding context usually created more damage than clarity. He looked at Rex again and noticed something subtle in the dog's posture, a slight tension in the hind legs, not fear, not aggression, but anticipation, as if Rex was waiting for a specific sequence to unfold rather than reacting to a threat. Daniel stood slowly, his gaze drifting from the suitcase to the perimeter lights of the depot, and for the first time he allowed himself to fully consider the possibility that this was not an isolated incident, that the suitcase might be a signal rather than a secret, a marker rather than a container. One of the officers stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, command is requesting immediate status." But Daniel did not answer right away, because his attention had shifted to something else, a faint irregular pattern in the ambient noise, the kind that only becomes noticeable when everything else is too quiet. A distant relay tower cycling unevenly, producing a rhythm that did not match the standard depot infrastructure. Rex's ears turned sharply toward that same direction, confirming that Daniel was not imagining it. The dog had detected it too, and that alignment between human perception and animal instinct created a tension that was harder to ignore than any instruction from command. Daniel finally spoke, his voice controlled but lower than before. "This is not a containment situation," he said, more to himself than anyone else, and the words seemed to settle into the space around them like a change in classification that had not yet been officially approved. Rex shifted his weight slightly, still not leaving the suitcase, but no longer reinforcing it as strongly, as if Daniel's acknowledgement had altered the parameters of his responsibility. Daniel took a slow step to the left, scanning the ground near the loading bay, direction Rex had indicated earlier, and now he noticed something he had missed before: faint tire impressions partially erased by time and weather, leading toward a restricted service corridor that was not listed in the current depot layout. The discovery tightened his focus immediately, because it suggested controlled movement rather than random placement. Someone had brought the suitcase here and left it under conditions that implied knowledge of how it would be found. Daniel turned back toward Rex and spoke quietly. "You followed this here." And Rex responded not with movement, but with presence, holding eye contact for a brief moment before returning his gaze to the suitcase, which told Daniel everything he needed to know about sequence. The dog had not discovered the object randomly. He had been placed with it, or had arrived through circumstances tied to it, and that realization shifted the situation from mystery to responsibility. The officers behind him were now visibly waiting for direction, but Daniel raised a single finger again, signaling patience, because rushing this moment would erase whatever fragile logic was holding it together. He crouched once more, this time not toward the suitcase, but toward Rex, placing himself at eye level, his tone softer now. "Whatever you are protecting, I need to understand why," he said, and Rex finally broke his stillness in a minimal, but meaningful way, turning his head slightly toward Daniel, then back toward the suitcase, as if offering a choice rather than an answer. Daniel studied that motion carefully, because it was not confusion, it was communication, structured and deliberate, and in that exchange he realized something important. Rex was not guarding the suitcase from people, he was guarding it for someone, or for something that required completion. Daniel slowly rose again, the weight of uncertainty still present, but now shaped into direction, and as he looked toward the service corridor beyond the lights, he made a decision not to open the suitcase yet, but to follow the path that had led it here. Because whatever truth was contained inside that locked metal shell was no longer the only thing waiting to be uncovered. Daniel moved first, not quickly, but with the controlled precision of someone who understood that rushing into uncertainty rarely produced clarity. The corridor beyond the loading bay was dimmer than the main depot lights, lined with older fixtures that hummed at a lower frequency, casting uneven shadows across the concrete floor. Rex followed without hesitation, not ahead, not behind, but parallel to Daniel, as if their movement had been silently synchronized long before. This moment, the military police officers trailed several steps back, maintaining distance but not disengaging, their attention divided between protocol and instinct. Daniel's eyes scanned the corridor walls as he walked, noticing outdated signage, partially replaced security panels, and maintenance markings that did not match current depot records. Each inconsistency adding another layer of confirmation that this area had been altered, repurposed, or deliberately ignored. Rex suddenly paused, near a junction where the corridor split, his ears pivoting sharply toward the left path, and Daniel stopped immediately, observing that reaction closely, because it was not hesitation, it was direction, the kind of certainty that does not require explanation. Daniel raised a hand again, signaling the others to stop, then stepped closer to the junction. The air here felt slightly cooler, carrying a faint metallic scent that suggested recent movement of equipment or sealed containers. He knelt briefly and ran his fingers along the floor near the base of the wall, noticing faint scuff marks consistent with something being dragged or repositioned. Not violently, but deliberately. Rex stood still, watching him, as if confirming that Daniel was finally reading the environment correctly. One of the officers whispered something about waiting for authorization, but Daniel ignored it, because authorization was no longer the limiting factor. Understanding was. He stood and chose the left corridor. Rex immediately matched his movement, and the group advanced deeper into the restricted section. The lighting grew more irregular as they moved, with occasional flickers that caused the shadows to shift in slow, unpredictable patterns. Daniel noted the increasing absence of standard depot indicators, no active security cameras, no updated access panels, and no emergency markers, which meant this corridor had either been decommissioned or intentionally bypassed from monitoring systems. Rex's pace remained steady but focused, his head slightly lowered now, not from fear, but concentration. And every few steps he would pause for a fraction of a second, as if confirming something only he could sense. Daniel observed these pauses carefully, realizing they aligned with subtle environmental changes, airflow shifts, temperature differences, and faint vibrations that were not visible to the human eye. They reached a secondary door marked with a faded identifier plate that had been partially removed, leaving only a fragment of classification code. Daniel stopped in front of it, studying the lock mechanism, which was older than the main depot system and required a manual override that was no longer standard procedure. Rex positioned himself slightly to the right of the door, not blocking it, but framing it, as if this was the expected destination rather than a barrier. Daniel placed his hand on the metal surface, feeling a faint residual warmth that suggested recent access, not hours ago, but within a much shorter window. He turned his head slightly toward Rex. "This is where it leads," he said quietly, and Rex responded by sitting down slowly, a deliberate and calm motion that carried an unexpected finality, as if confirming arrival rather than waiting for action. Behind them, the officers halted at a respectful distance, their silence now carrying a heavier weight than before. Daniel exhaled slowly, his thoughts narrowing into focus, because everything about this location suggested continuity rather than coincidence. The suitcase had not been placed randomly, Rex had not been assigned randomly, and this corridor had not been forgotten by accident. Daniel adjusted his stance, and looked once more at the door, then back at Rex, who remained completely still, watching him with steady intent. And in that moment, Daniel understood that whatever was inside the locked suitcase was not the beginning of this situation. It was the final piece waiting to connect to something already unfolding behind this sealed corridor. The heavy door at the end of the corridor stood motionless under the dim flicker of an aging overhead light, its surface marked by scratches, maintenance codes partially removed, and a faint outline where an identification plate had once been. Daniel Carter stood in front of it for several seconds without speaking, not because he lacked action, but because he understood that the next step would define the direction of everything that had led him here. Rex remained seated slightly behind and to the right, perfectly aligned with the door, as if it were not an obstacle, but a threshold he had already accepted. The military police officers held position several feet back, their presence quiet but alert, waiting for instruction that no one was fully certain should come from command or from the situation itself. Daniel slowly exhaled and placed his hand against the door frame, feeling a faint vibration through the metal that suggested something active on the other side. Not dangerous, but present, controlled, and intentionally maintained. He turned his head slightly toward Rex, and for the first time Rex stood without prompting, stepping forward until he was parallel with Daniel at the door. The movement was calm, deliberate, and final in a way that removed any remaining doubt that this was the intended point of arrival. Daniel reached for the manual override panel, noticing it was not standard military issue, but a hybrid system, combining older mechanical input with a newer coded bypass that had been installed later, which suggested selective access rather than full restriction. He hesitated for only a moment before beginning the sequence. The silence behind him felt heavier now, not because of fear, but because of anticipation, as if the entire corridor had narrowed its attention to this single action. Rex lowered his head slightly, not in submission, but in focus, his gaze fixed on the door as if tracking something beyond sound or sight. Daniel completed the override input, and the lock released with a controlled mechanical click that echoed softly through the corridor. For a brief moment, nothing moved. No immediate reaction, no sudden change in atmosphere, only stillness. Daniel placed his hand on the handle, but did not open it yet. Instead, he looked at Rex once more, and what he saw there confirmed something he had begun to understand earlier. Rex was not guarding against intrusion. He was holding position at the boundary of something already contained. Daniel slowly pulled the door open, the motion steady and deliberate, revealing a room beyond that was dimly lit by a single overhead source casting a soft neutral glow across organized equipment tables and sealed storage units. Nothing chaotic, nothing broken, everything arranged with precise intention as if awaiting verification rather than discovery. Daniel stepped inside first, followed by Rex without hesitation. The military police officers remained at the threshold, respecting the unspoken signal that this space was not yet fully transferred under their authority. Inside the room, Daniel immediately noticed the absence of standard labeling, replaced instead with minimal identifiers and coded tags that did not correspond to any active depot registry. The atmosphere felt controlled, almost preserved, as if the room had been paused in time rather than abandoned. Rex moved slowly forward, his steps measured, until he reached the center of the room where a reinforced metal table stood under the light, and on that table rested the locked suitcase, now seen from a different angle, positioned with deliberate precision as if it had been placed there rather than carried. Daniel approached cautiously, his eyes scanning the surroundings before returning to the suitcase, and that was when he noticed a secondary detail he had not seen before: a thin monitoring device attached discreetly to the underside of the table, its indicator light faint but steady, suggesting continuous observation rather than storage. Daniel's expression tightened slightly, not with alarm, but with recognition that this was no longer about an unknown object. It was about a controlled condition being maintained for a purpose not yet fully revealed. Rex stood beside the table now, no longer blocking or guiding, simply present, as if confirming that the final boundary had been reached. Daniel placed both hands near the suitcase without touching it, studying its seams, its reinforced locks, and the subtle markings that indicated it had been opened before and resealed under strict procedure. He exhaled slowly, Realizing that whatever was inside was not hidden in panic or secrecy alone, it was preserved with intention, and in that realization Daniel understood the most important truth so far. The suitcase was not the mystery itself. It was the final container of something that had already been set in motion long before midnight ever arrived inside the controlled silence of the secure room. The air felt different from the corridor outside, as if the space itself had been intentionally stabilized to preserve whatever truth it contained. Daniel Carter stood a few feet from the metal table where the suitcase rested, his eyes moving slowly. Across every detail, the reinforced corners, the dual lock system, and the faint signs of previous inspection that had been carefully undone and restored, Rex remained beside him, no longer shifting or reacting, but fully still in a way that suggested absolute focus rather than uncertainty. The overhead light cast a steady neutral glow that eliminated shadows around the suitcase, making it appear less like an object of mystery and more like a focal point of deliberate design. Behind them, the military police officers maintained their position at the doorway, not entering further, respecting a boundary that had become less about physical restriction and more about situational authority. Daniel slowly circled the table, taking in the full environment of the room, noting the absence of standard labeling systems and the presence of outdated storage configurations that had been repurposed with minimal documentation. Every observation reinforced the same conclusion forming in his mind. This was not an abandoned asset. It was a controlled holding space. Daniel stopped opposite Rex, and for a moment neither of them moved, the silence between them carrying a weight that felt structured rather than empty. Daniel lowered his gaze to the suitcase again, and this time he noticed something new, a thin seam along the lower edge that suggested it had been opened before with precision tools rather than force, meaning whoever had handled it understood exactly what they were doing. He reached into his pocket and retrieved a small diagnostic reader, activating it near the surface. The device emitted a soft, consistent tone followed by irregular fluctuations, as if receiving partial but fragmented data. Daniel frowned slightly, adjusting the angle, and the reading stabilized just enough to confirm that the suitcase contained not a single object, but multiple layered components shielded by interference material designed to prevent full detection. Rex shifted his weight slightly for the first time since entering the room, not in alarm, but in acknowledgement, as if confirming that Daniel was now seeing the situation correctly. Daniel exhaled slowly, his attention narrowing as he considered the implications. Because layered containment of this type was not used for storage, it was used for protection, preservation, or concealment of something that required controlled discovery. One of the officers at the doorway spoke quietly. "Sir, Command is requesting status update." But Daniel did not respond immediately, because his focus had already moved beyond procedural communication. He was now observing the environment as a system rather than a location, and everything about it suggested intentional staging. Rex stepped closer to the table, stopping just short of contact with the suitcase, his posture unchanged but his presence more defined, as if anchoring the moment itself. Daniel placed both hands on the edge of the table without touching the suitcase, leaning slightly forward to examine the lock mechanism more closely. And that was when he noticed the final indicator he had missed before, a faint calibration seal along the side panel that matched an older military encryption standard used only within limited operational units that had since been declassified. His expression tightened slightly, not with fear, but with recognition that this was not a random object placed under guard. It was a deliberately maintained asset tied to a structured event. Daniel slowly straightened, his eyes shifting between Rex and the suitcase, and for the first time he understood that Rex was not reacting to the object itself, but to what it represented, a continuity of responsibility that extended beyond physical presence. Daniel stepped back half a pace, reassessing everything he thought he understood. Because the suitcase was no longer the center of the situation, it was a marker, and whatever truth it contained had already shaped the actions, movements, and decisions that brought them all into this room long before any of them arrived. Daniel remained still for several seconds after stepping back from the table. Not because he was uncertain about what he was seeing, but because he was processing the structure behind what he was not yet allowed to fully understand. The controlled room around him felt almost clinical in its precision, as if every object had been placed with intent rather than convenience. Rex stood near the edge of the table, perfectly aligned with the locked suitcase, his gaze fixed forward without deviation, not at Daniel, not at the officers behind him, but at the object itself as if it represented something larger than its physical form. The silence in the room had shifted now, no longer observational but anticipatory. Daniel slowly turned his attention back to the suitcase, and this time he noticed a subtle detail along the upper hinge, a secondary seal that appeared newer than the rest of the casing, suggesting recent intervention, not historical storage. He stepped closer again, lowering his voice unconsciously as though sound itself might disrupt the condition of the room. One of the military police officers adjusted slightly at the doorway, then stopped, clearly sensing that any movement now would interrupt a process already in motion. Daniel retrieved his diagnostic reader once more and activated a narrow scan across the surface. The device responded with a layered pattern of inconsistent signals. But beneath the interference, there was something stable, a repeating signature that indicated active containment rather than passive storage. He frowned slightly, narrowing his eyes as he adjusted the position of the scanner, and the signal refined just enough to confirm that the suitcase was not simply locked. It was maintained. Daniel lowered the device slowly, his attention shifting to Rex, and for a brief moment their eyes met, not in command and obedience, but in mutual recognition of something neither of them had yet fully defined. Rex did not move, but the tension in his stance subtly changed, as if acknowledging that the next action belonged entirely to Daniel. Daniel exhaled slowly, placing his hand near the lock mechanism but not touching it, because something about the situation suggested that opening it prematurely would not reveal truth. It would disrupt sequence. He turned his head slightly toward the officers and spoke in a calm, controlled tone. Maintain position and do not interfere unless instructed. The officers nodded without argument, their focus now fully fixed on Daniel. Rather than procedure, Daniel returned his attention to the suitcase, and in that moment he noticed something that altered his understanding again. A faint pulse of light reflecting through a narrow seam in the casing. So subtle it could have been mistaken for reflection, but too consistent to be random. Rex shifted one step closer, then stopped, his presence now directly aligned with Daniel's position at the table. And for the first time Daniel considered that Rex was not only guarding the object, but synchronizing with it, as if both were part of a system still operating beyond visible observation. Daniel lowered his voice almost to a whisper, speaking not to the room, but to the logic forming inside it. "This is still active," he said quietly, and the words seemed to settle into the air with unusual weight. The officers exchanged a brief glance, but remained silent, understanding that confirmation at this level did not require reaction, only awareness. Daniel stepped to the side of the table, scanning the underside again, and that was when he noticed a second calibration seal, partially obscured, matching the same outdated operational code he had seen earlier in the corridor, confirming continuity between the path and the object. Rex finally moved his head slightly, not toward Daniel, not toward the officers, but toward the suitcase itself, and that motion carried something more precise than instinct. It carried certainty. Daniel straightened slowly, his thoughts aligning into a single unavoidable conclusion. The suitcase was not an endpoint. It was a controlled node within a larger structure, and whatever had been placed inside was being preserved not for secrecy alone, but for timing. And as Daniel stood there in the quiet hum of the secured room, he understood that opening it would not simply reveal what was inside. It would complete whatever process had already been set in motion long before any of them ever stepped into the corridor. The room remained unchanged on the surface, but something about it had shifted in meaning, as if the realization Daniel Carter had just formed was now quietly rewriting the purpose of everything inside it. The overhead light continued its steady neutral glow, reflecting off the metal table where the suitcase rested with deliberate precision. Rex stood beside it in the same position he had held since entering. But now there was something different in his stillness, not tension, not alertness, but a kind of final confirmation, as if he had fulfilled every step required of him and was now waiting for the human decision that would complete the sequence. Daniel slowly exhaled, his gaze fixed on the suitcase without blinking, because the truth forming in his mind was no longer theoretical. It was structural. The suitcase was not an isolated object, It was a trigger point within a controlled system that had already executed most of its intended process. He glanced briefly toward the military police officers at the doorway, their faces calm but focused, waiting for authorization that no longer felt like the correct framework for what was happening. Daniel stepped closer to the table again, this time without hesitation, his movements slower but more certain, and as he approached he noticed something new that had not been visible before. A faint shift in the casing's surface, almost imperceptible, like internal calibration. Responding to proximity rather than external input, Rex responded instantly to Daniel's movement by adjusting his stance by a fraction, aligning himself more precisely with the suitcase rather than blocking or guarding it. Daniel placed his hand lightly on the edge of the table, feeling the subtle vibration that had been present before but now felt more defined, more structured, as if the object inside was not only contained but actively maintaining equilibrium. He spoke quietly without turning his head. "This is not waiting," he said, more to himself than anyone else, and the words seemed to settle into the room without resistance. One of the officers shifted slightly, but did not interrupt. Daniel removed his hand and circled the table once more, studying every angle of the suitcase with renewed clarity. The seams, the reinforced locks, the layered seals, all of it pointing toward a system designed not to hide, but to regulate access over time. Rex remained motionless, his eyes fixed forward, and for the first time Daniel noticed that the dog was not reacting to uncertainty. He was reflecting certainty, as if the presence of the suitcase was not a mystery to him, but a known constant. Daniel stopped again at the opposite side of the table and closed his eyes briefly, recalling the corridor, the restricted junction, the directional pauses in Rex's movement, the alignment of environmental indicators that had led them here step by step. When he opened his eyes again, his expression had changed, not to resolution, but to understanding that he was now inside a sequence already in motion. He turned his head slightly toward Rex and spoke softly. "You knew this place before I did," and Rex did not move, but his gaze shifted ever so slightly toward Daniel in acknowledgement without deviation from the suitcase. Daniel nodded once, slowly, because the confirmation did not require interpretation. It only required acceptance. The officers at the doorway remained still, sensing that whatever threshold existed in this room had already been crossed in principle. Daniel stepped back from the table and looked at the suitcase one final time, and in that moment he understood that the decision he was about to make was not about opening or not opening an object. It was about choosing whether to complete a process that had been carefully maintained, silently protected, and deliberately preserved until the exact moment he arrived. Daniel Carter stood still for a long moment after stepping back from the table, not because he was waiting for permission, but because he was fully aware that whatever came next would not be reversible in the way most decisions were. The secure room around him remained unchanged in its physical form, yet the meaning of everything inside it had shifted into something final. Rex had not moved from his position beside the suitcase, but now his stillness carried a different quality, not anticipation, but completion, as if every action required of him had already been fulfilled and only the human decision remained unresolved. Daniel slowly exhaled and looked once more at the metal case, its surface reflecting the steady overhead light with a calmness that no longer felt neutral, because now he understood it was not an ordinary object under protection. It was a sealed conclusion waiting to be acknowledged. One of the military police officers at the doorway adjusted his stance slightly, but no one spoke, because even the presence of authority felt secondary in this moment. Daniel stepped forward again, this time without hesitation, his boots quiet against the reinforced floor, and as he approached the table, he noticed something subtle that had not been visible before, a faint alignment of indicator marks along the side seam, almost invisible unless viewed from this exact angle, confirming that the casing had been designed for staged access, rather than emergency breach. Rex shifted his head slightly toward Daniel, not as a warning, but as confirmation. Daniel placed his hand gently on the top of the suitcase, feeling a faint vibration that traveled through the metal and into his palm, not mechanical instability, but rhythmic consistency, as if something within had been maintaining a controlled cycle for an extended period of time. He closed his eyes briefly, and in that moment everything he had observed since arriving began to connect in a way that removed uncertainty. The corridor alignment, the directional pauses, the controlled maintenance room, the absence of standard registry. All of it had been leading to this single contained point. Daniel opened his eyes and spoke quietly, almost as if speaking to himself. This was never hidden, he said. It was preserved. Rex remained still, but his ears shifted slightly forward. Acknowledging the accuracy of the observation, Daniel slowly moved his hand toward the primary lock mechanism, not to force it, but to initiate the final release sequence he now understood had been waiting for authorization that was not procedural, but situational. He entered a short manual override code using the side panel, and the suitcase responded with a soft mechanical click that echoed gently through the room. There was no alarm, no resistance, only confirmation. Daniel paused for one final second, then lifted the lid. The interior did not reveal chaos or disorder, but precise organization, a sealed internal compartment system layered with protected materials. At the top rested a compact recording device secured within a padded frame. Beneath it were structured documents sealed in transparent protective sleeves, and at the center of everything were two military identification tags worn smooth by use. Daniel did not touch anything immediately, instead observing carefully as the overhead light revealed subtle markings on the recording device casing. Markings that matched classification patterns from a unit Daniel had once been assigned to, but had never seen referenced outside control briefings. Rex stepped forward slowly and stopped beside the open suitcase, not looking at the contents with curiosity, but with recognition, as if he had already encountered what was inside in another context of memory. Daniel finally reached for the recording device and activated it. The screen flickered softly before displaying a single archived entry labeled with a date that matched the final operation he had been part of years earlier. His expression tightened slightly, not in shock, but in recognition of continuity, because what played was not an explanation of events, but a structured record of decisions, movements, and outcomes that had never been formally closed. The voice within the recording was calm, controlled, and unmistakably tied to the same operational framework Daniel remembered, describing not an incident, but a sequence that had required preservation until all involved parties were accounted for. Daniel lowered the device slightly, his eyes shifting toward Rex. And in that moment, the final connection became clear. Rex had not been guarding a secret. He had been maintaining a promise encoded into action, a living continuation of an unfinished protocol tied not to command, but to trust. Daniel slowly closed the suitcase lid halfway, not to hide it again, but to acknowledge completion of what it represented. And as he stood there in the quiet hum of the secured room, he understood that the truth was never meant to be discovered all at once. It was meant to arrive only when every part of the system still standing was finally in place.